It's been over a decade since Matt Murdock suited up in live action in Ben Affleck's 2003 film version of Daredevil. Can Marvel Studios add the Man Without Fear to its crown jewels of the MCU? Johnny Torch here with another Torch review. Netflix's first of 5 proposed series takes on the character of Matt Murdock, the blind lawyer from Hell's Kitchen, who eventually dons a crimson costume and uses his stunning radar sense to do serious damage to the organized crime of New York. His main opposition to this goal is Wilson Fisk, better known to comic fans as the Kingpin of Crime. The series is pretty much an elongated origin story for Daredevil as well as Kingpin, who never actually is called Kingpin in the show, by the way. It's basically like taking the first 45 minutes of the prototypical superhero origin film and stretching it to 12 hours. It's a blessing and a curse, since the origin story told well and in capable hands is often the most compelling part of a superhero movie, where the hero finds his motivation and struggles to get to his goals and accomplish them. However, there comes a point where you want him to put on the costume, find the nearest supervillain, and get on with it already. I'll admit to feeling that way several times during this series. I enjoyed the cast very much. Charlie Cox does a fine job as Matt Murdock, the Daredevil. I was also very impressed with Eldon Henson, who plays Foggy Nelson, Matt's law partner, and Deborah Ann Wall, who plays Karen Page, their secretary and first client. The interaction of these three was the highlight of the show to me. I always liked Daredevil's early supporting cast in the comic Stan Lee era, and Karen most notably was reduced to little more than a cameo in the '03 movie. Speaking of both Stan Lee and cameos, Stan the Man has no cameo in this series, which is very disappointing given that Stan typically names Daredevil as one of his favorite creations. We get a few flashbacks to Matt's childhood. We don't actually get to see the accident that imbues him with his radar powers, but the aftermath. Most of the series has the problem of telling, not showing. We never really get to see how Matt sees through his radar sense beyond a very brief segment. I don't know if it was not in their budget or just another of the apparent minimalist choices they decided to go with. We get to see the fate of Matt's dad battling Jack Murdock, who runs afoul of the mob by refusing to throw a fight. I thought the scenes were very effective in showing the great rapport between Matt and his dad. I was a bit dubious as to the fact that we're never really allowed to actually see Jack box in the ring, again telling, not showing, but it may have something to do with the actor playing Jack, John Patrick Hayden, who, while a good actor, doesn't really look like a boxer. I was generally pleased with the way they showed Matt's Catholicism and how it guided his life. There are several scenes of Matt in church and talking to his priest and having meaningful discussions regarding his life's mission. We also get to see Matt's early training with Stick and subsequent re-teaming with him in present day, an enjoyable turn by Scott Glenn. Matt also allies himself with Claire Temple, played by Rosario Dawson, who plays minor comics character Night Nurse. I was a bit leery of her addition. After all, Matt has no dearth of beautiful women he's been associated with in the comics. No need to create a new romance for him. But the romance is basically ended before it's begun, and Dawson mostly serves as a sounding board to try and get the audience's uninitiated up to speed with Daredevil's abilities. There are no real supervillains throughout the season, mostly different mobs that answer in one way or another to Fisk. Bob Gunton, who plays the humorous Leland Owsley, who in typical Gotham fashion is apparently the father of comic villain the Owl. Fisk's right-hand man, James Wesley, played to smarmy perfection by Toby Leonard Moore, and even Daredevil's famous stoolie, Turk, played by Rob Morgan. Vincent D'Onofrio does a good job as Fisk, playing him as a damaged idealist who eventually grows confidence and embraces his darkest impulses. We see his origin story in an unsettling flashback to his childhood. Much like the comics, Fisk's world revolves around the woman who would be his wife, Vanessa, played by Superman's mom in Man of Steel, Elliot Zur. And special time is taken to show their courtship. Vaughn D. Curtis Hall plays Ben Urich. In the comics, his main claim to fame is discovering Matt's identity as the Daredevil. He doesn't get that far here. His role is to assist Karen's investigation into Fisk while caring for his wife, who is ailing from an undisclosed illness. This storyline, among others, is fairly slow-moving and, at least at first, very uninteresting. Daredevil doesn't actually wear the famous crimson costume but for the final half hour or so of the final episode. Rather, he wears a dark black costume reminiscent of Rex Smith's costume for a trial of the Incredible Hulk. I was a bit disappointed by this choice, but once the familiar costume finally shows up, it looks great. It is missing the famous Daredevil logo on his chest, but apparently Matt didn't choose his moniker himself, hence its omission. Oh well, maybe next time. Alright, time for the final analysis. My biggest disappointment was the lack of big action set pieces. There is very little comic book spectacle to go around. Daredevil punches a few guys, but is generally only in the episodes for 5 minutes or so. It reminds me of my complaints on Man of Steel, where the action was bland, consisting of characters just punching each other with very little emotional involvement. There was a few good action sequences, most noteworthy being Daredevil going up against the Red Ninja, and of course his showdown with Fisk. But most other sequences don't really focus on the action. For example, in the final episode, Daredevil takes out a whole room of crooks while we focus on a scared man's face, eyes closed. I felt like yelling to the cameraman, "Hey buddy, could you turn the camera around? I'd really like to see this." And there are other such examples. It's also somewhat disheartening that Daredevil seems to have such difficulty with low-level petty crooks. With his heightened senses and level of training, one would think he'd be up to the task. But if he gets the crap beat out of him so easily, how is he going to fare against greater threats in the future? You know, actual supervillains? The series is also very slow-moving, with several 10-minute conversations per episode, oftentimes consisting solely of subtitles. There are some good character-building moments, one of my favorites being the flashback to Foggy meeting Matt, but most often conversations go on much longer than necessary. Frankly, I hate lawyer shows, and I feared it would try too hard to be a Law and Order type show, but surprisingly, Matt and Foggy are in the courtroom only once during the whole series. The violence is extreme, and in most cases, extremely unnecessary. I can get the idea that Kingpin is trying to decapitate somebody without seeing a full 3 minutes of it. Less is more in this series, except in the violence department, it seems. I also thought the profanity, which was not a big deal to me in the early episodes, became excessive by the midway point. It started getting to the point of hearing a profanity in every scene, which became annoying. It's a shame that apparently they don't care about kids getting into the character of Daredevil, since I couldn't justify any kids watching this show. There really is a lack of comic book fun and spectacle that we've become accustomed to with Marvel here. There are a few references to the MCU at large sprinkled in, but they seem to have made the conscious decision to distance themselves from it as much as possible, which I find odd given its property's connectivity is a hallmark of Marvel. It's a shame they really tried to squeeze the comic bookiness from the concept to better mold it to the typical crime drama format a la The Sopranos. It's not that a dark and gritty take can't be entertaining. The Dark Knight trilogy proved that to be true, but Nolan knew when to throw the fans a bone. Needless to say, I still prefer Ben Affleck's 03 movie to this series. Still, the cast is great, and they did justice to their characters in Daredevil's world. I'm only hoping that it gets less bland and more exciting going forward. They really have a great springboard now for going into a second season. I give Daredevil the series 3.5 stars out of 5. This is Johnnie Torch reminding you to keep the flame burning brightly, and I'll see you again soon. Remember to go to my website, Bullets Bourbon Comics, to check out the latest issue of The Adventures of Bullets Bourbon, Private Eye.